Atlas had never broken heel in 6 years, but the moment a stranger whispered his name, the old German shepherd walked away from Caleb Rowe as though answering a call buried deeper than memory. The county fair moved around them in a bright, restless blur. Children hurried past with paper cups of lemonade. A Ferris wheel turned slowly against the late afternoon sky, its colored lights beginning to glow while the sun sank behind the cottonwoods. Somewhere beyond the livestock barns, a fiddler played through a crackling speaker. The air smelled of hay, kettle corn, warm dust, and rain waiting somewhere beyond the hills. Caleb stood near a booth raising money for local veterans, one hand resting loosely on Atlas's leash. He was a broad-shouldered white man in his late 30s, dressed in worn jeans, clean boots, and a faded olive jacket that still held the straight lines of military habit. Crowds had never felt simple since he left the Marines. Too many footsteps, too many voices arriving from places he could not see. Atlas made them bearable. The dog stayed close, calm and steady, matching Caleb's pace without needing a command. He had done so in grocery stores, hospital corridors, crowded train stations, and during nights when Caleb woke before dawn with his heart racing against an enemy that was no longer there. Atlas did not wander. He did not pull. He did not forget. Then his ears lifted. His body became still beneath the noise of the fair. Caleb felt the change through the leash before he saw it. Atlas raised his nose and drew in a slow breath. His amber eyes fixed on the far side of the walkway, where an older man stood beside a booth displaying weathered military patches and old service photographs. The stranger wore a brown work coat despite the warmth. One leg seemed stiff beneath him, and his left hand remained hidden inside his pocket. He was not looking at the merchandise. He was looking at Atlas. "Easy, boy," Caleb murmured. Atlas took one step forward. Caleb shortened the leash. The dog took another. The metal clip gave a soft, sharp rattle. It was such a small sound, but Caleb felt it travel through him like a warning bell. The stranger's face changed. Not surprise, not fear. Grief, perhaps, though it passed too quickly to name. He lowered his chin and spoke so softly the words should have disappeared beneath the music and laughter. "Atlas." The dog heard him. Atlas moved with quiet certainty, pulling harder than Caleb had ever felt him pull before. "Hold," Caleb said. Atlas stopped, but his eyes never left the man. A thin sound escaped his throat, not a bark or growl, but something almost wounded. The stranger slowly removed his hand from his pocket. A pale curved scar crossed his palm. Atlas stared at it, trembling once from shoulders to tail. Caleb stepped between them. "How do you know my dog's name?" The old man looked past him, directly into Atlas's eyes. His voice carried the weight of a door opening after years sealed shut. "Because," he said, "I knew him before he belonged to you." Caleb did not answer at once. The fair continued around them as if nothing had changed. A bell rang from the ring toss booth. A child laughed somewhere near the carousel. The smell of roasted corn drifted across the walkway, sweet and smoky, but Caleb noticed none of it. His hand had tightened around the leash until the leather pressed hard against his palm. Atlas remained still beside him, yet every line of the dog's body leaned toward the stranger. The old man looked as though he wanted to step closer, but something held him back. Maybe shame, maybe fear. Caleb had seen both before. "You should explain that," Caleb said. His voice stayed low, calm in the way Marines learned to sound when calm was the last thing they felt. The stranger glanced toward the crowd. People passed between them carrying stuffed animals, paper plates, and plastic cups bright with ice. For a moment, the man seemed ready to disappear into the movement. Atlas gave another quiet whine. The sound stopped him. He looked down at the German shepherd with an expression so tender it made Caleb more uneasy, not less. "Not here," the man said. "Then where?" Caleb asked. The stranger nodded toward the livestock barns, where the noise thinned beneath long wooden roofs and rows of hanging bulbs. "Somewhere quieter." Caleb did not move. Atlas did. The dog turned toward the barns, then looked back at Caleb as though the decision had already been made. That was unlike him too. Caleb studied the stranger's face, searching for a lie, but found only fatigue carved deep around the eyes. He finally gave the leash a little slack. They walked together without speaking. Gravel shifted beneath their boots. The music faded behind them, replaced by the softer sounds of horses breathing in their stalls, buckets being set down, and dry hay brushing against wooden boards. Atlas kept 3 feet ahead, his nose lifted, following something Caleb could not see. Near the entrance to the oldest barn, the dog stopped beside a faded display of service photographs mounted beneath a sign honoring working animals from the county. Caleb had passed it earlier without noticing. Atlas had not, his gaze fixed on one black and white photograph near the bottom corner. In it, a younger version of the stranger knelt beside a German shepherd barely more than a year old. The dog had broad paws, alert ears, and a small white mark beneath his chest. Caleb looked down at Atlas. The same mark showed through the sable fur. A cold stillness settled inside him. Beneath the photograph, a brass plate carried only a date, the words County K-9 Training Program, and a line that had been scratched until the lettering was nearly gone. Caleb leaned closer. One number remained clear. 17. The stranger stood behind him now, close enough that Caleb could hear the uneven rhythm of his breathing. That was him, the man said. Caleb turned. Atlas. The stranger shook his head. Not then. Atlas stepped toward the photograph and pressed his nose to the glass. The old man watched him with wet eyes. Back then, they called him 17. Caleb felt the answer land heavily, opening more questions than it closed. And what did you call him? The stranger looked at the curved scar across his palm, then slowly opened his hand. Atlas, he said, because he carried more than any dog should have had to carry. The stranger closed his hand again, hiding the scar as if the name had cost him something to say. Atlas remained near the photograph, his nose resting against the glass for one quiet second before he turned and looked back at the old man. Caleb saw recognition there. Not the alertness Atlas gave to a new scent. Not the patience he offered strangers who wanted to pet him. This was older, deeper, the kind of knowing that lived below command and memory. What is your name? Caleb asked. The man hesitated. Outside the barn, a cheer rose from the grandstand, followed by the bright chime of the public address system. Inside, the air was cooler and carried the clean, dry scent of hay, leather, and sawdust. A horse shifted in a nearby stall. Somewhere farther down the aisle, a metal latch clicked softly. Elias Mercer, the man said at last. I worked with him before he entered military service. Caleb studied him. Elias looked to be in his early 60s, though hard years had added more. His gray hair was cut short, uneven around the ears, and his coat carried the faint smell of cedar smoke. One boot was worn lower at the heel, explaining the careful drag in his step. Why was his record changed? Caleb asked. Elias looked toward the photograph instead of answering. Records are written by people, he said. People leave things out. Caleb felt his jaw tighten. That is not an answer. Elias gave a tired nod. No, it is not. Atlas moved closer to him. Elias took one step back. The dog stopped immediately. That small exchange told Caleb more than words could. Elias wanted the reunion, but did not believe he had earned it. He remembers you, Caleb said. Elias swallowed. Dogs remember what matters. Then why are you backing away? For the first time, Elias looked directly at Caleb. His eyes were pale blue and unguarded now. Because remembering is not the same as forgiving. Atlas lowered his head, then slowly lifted one front paw. He held it there, suspended, waiting. Elias stared at the gesture. His breath caught. He still does that, he whispered. Caleb glanced down. Does what? Leads with the left paw when he is asking permission. Caleb had seen the habit hundreds of times. Before stepping into a truck. Before crossing a doorway. Before climbing onto the porch beside Caleb on nights when neither of them could sleep. Caleb had always believed it was simply Atlas being careful. Elias lowered himself slowly, favoring his stiff leg, until he was nearly level with the dog. He did not reach out. He only opened his scarred hand and held it between them. Atlas leaned forward and breathed in. The barn seemed to grow silent around that single breath. Then the German shepherd pressed his nose into Elias's palm. Elias shut his eyes. His shoulders trembled once. Caleb looked away, giving the moment the privacy it deserved, but his attention caught on the photograph again. Beneath the scratched plate, almost hidden by dust, was a second line of lettering. He wiped it with his thumb. 3 words appeared. Presumed lost during transfer. Caleb turned sharply. They listed him as lost. Elias rose too quickly and reached for the wall to steady himself. Caleb, he said, using his name for the first time. Caleb froze. He had never introduced himself. Elias saw the realization in his face. From outside came 3 short notes from a carnival whistle. Atlas dropped low at once, turned toward the nearest exit, and scanned the aisle with perfect precision. Elias went pale. "Take him home," he said. "Before dark." Caleb kept his eyes on Elias while the 3 notes faded beneath the noise of the fair. Atlas remained low, shoulders steady, amber gaze moving from one doorway to the next, as if the old signal had opened a room inside him that Caleb had never seen. "You know my name?" Caleb said. Elias did not deny it. He looked toward the barn entrance, where late sunlight had turned the dust in the air to gold. Families moved past outside with balloons and paper trays, unaware that a history someone had tried to erase was standing only a few feet away. "I know more than your name," Elias said. "Then start talking." Caleb's voice was quiet, but there was no softness in it now. Elias bent to pick up a canvas satchel resting beside the wall. The bag was faded and patched at one corner. A small brass whistle hung from the strap. Atlas saw it immediately. His ears tipped forward. Elias noticed and tucked the whistle beneath the flap. "Not here," he said. "You already said that." "And I meant it." Caleb stepped closer. He was taller by several inches, but Elias did not seem intimidated. He only seemed tired. "You told me to take him home before dark." "What?" Elias glanced toward the west end of the fairgrounds. Beyond the Ferris wheel, clouds had begun to gather in a long gray line above the hills. "Because certain sounds wake old training," he said. "And this place is full of them." As if to prove him right, another game booth released 3 bright blasts from a plastic horn. Atlas shifted before the final note ended. He turned toward Caleb, checked his position, then faced the nearest exit. The movement was precise, almost graceful. Caleb felt a chill despite the warm air. What was he trained to do? Read a space before a command was given. That is not standard. "No," Elias said. It was not. Atlas rose and walked toward the barn aisle, nose low. Caleb let the leash slide through his hand, but did not release it. The dog stopped beside a locked display case filled with old county records, medals, and photographs. His nose touched the bottom corner. Elias went still. Caleb followed Atlas's gaze and saw a thin manila envelope lying behind the glass, partly hidden beneath a stack of event programs. A black stamp marked one edge. K917. Caleb looked at Elias. "You knew that was here." "I hoped it was gone." "What is inside?" Elias did not answer. Caleb searched the frame and found a simple latch secured by a small key lock. At that moment, an elderly volunteer approached from the next aisle carrying a ring of keys. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" she asked. Caleb pointed to the envelope. "Who placed that in the display?" The woman adjusted her glasses and leaned closer. "That came from the old training office when the county cleared the storage building. Most of those files were supposed to be archived." Her eyes moved to Elias, and recognition softened her face. "Mercer, I have not seen you in years." Elias lowered his gaze. The woman looked from him to Atlas, then back again. "Oh," she whispered. "So he made it." Caleb's grip tightened on the leash. "You knew too?" The woman slowly unlocked the case. The click sounded louder than it should have. She removed the envelope and handed it to Caleb. Elias reached out as if to stop him, but his hand fell away. Caleb opened the flap. Inside was a photograph, a transfer form, and one page stamped confidential. His own name had been circled in dark blue ink. Beneath it, written by hand, were 6 words. "He understands silence. Send the dog to him." Caleb lifted his eyes. Elias was already backing toward the barn door. "You chose me," Caleb said. Elias stopped, but did not turn around. Atlas stood between them, watching both men as the first low rumble of thunder rolled across the fairgrounds. The thunder faded, but the words on the page stayed between them. Caleb looked again at the dark blue circle around his name, then at the sentence beneath it. "He understands silence. Send the dog to him." For years, he had believed Atlas came into his life through chance, paperwork, and the quiet machinery of military reassignment. Now that belief felt thin. Elias stood with one hand resting against the barn door frame, his back turned, the canvas satchel hanging from his shoulder. Atlas watched him with the stillness of a sentry who had waited a very long time for one man to stop leaving. "You chose me," Caleb repeated. Elias finally turned. "I chose the possibility of you. That is not the same thing." "No," Elias said. "It is not." Rain began tapping softly against the metal roof, light at first, almost delicate. The fair outside shifted beneath the changing weather. Vendors pulled canvas covers over tables. Parents gathered jackets from strollers. The Ferris wheel slowed until its colored cars hung motionless against the gray sky. Atlas lifted his nose toward the rain, then looked toward the far end of the barn. A nervous sound moved through the livestock stalls. Hooves shuffled. Wooden rails creaked. Caleb folded the papers and placed them back inside the envelope. Why was Atlas listed as lost? Elias's eyes settled on the dog. Because that was safer than the truth. Safer for whom? Elias took a long breath. Not for me. Before Caleb could press further, a sharp metallic clang echoed from outside, followed by startled voices. A loose gate near the cattle exhibit had swung open in the rising wind. One of the larger animals had wandered into the service lane, confused by the lights and noise. Fair workers moved quickly but carefully, trying to guide it away from the main walkway without frightening it. At the same time, a little girl in a yellow raincoat stood frozen beside a stack of feed bins, separated from her father by nearly 30 feet of open ground. Caleb saw the problem at once. Too much noise. Too many people moving at different angles. Atlas saw it sooner. The dog stepped forward, body lowered, eyes fixed not on the animal, but on the narrow path between the girl and the nearest fence. Stay, Caleb commanded. Atlas held for half a second. Then he looked toward Elias. Elias's face changed. He reached beneath the flap of his satchel and drew out the brass whistle. Caleb raised a hand. Do not. Elias did not blow it. He gave 3 soft notes with his lips instead. Atlas moved. Not fast. Not wild. He crossed the service lane in a wide curve, quiet and controlled, placing himself where the animal could see him without feeling trapped. The animal turned its head. Atlas shifted 1 step to the side. Then another. Each movement opened a clearer path away from the child. Caleb moved at the same time, crossing behind the feed bins until he reached the girl. Come with me, he said gently. She took his hand. Her father hurried forward and pulled her into his arms. Across the lane, Atlas continued the slow arc until the animal followed the open gate back toward its enclosure. The crowd exhaled as one. No shouting, no panic, just rain, breath, and the soft thud of hooves returning to packed earth. Elias leaned heavily against the fence, one hand gripping the top rail. Atlas came back to him first. The German shepherd pressed close to his leg, steadying him without command. Caleb approached with the girl's yellow sleeve still warm against his palm. That was the signal, he said. Elias nodded. Yes. The one from the old program. Another nod. Caleb looked at Atlas, then at the whistle in Elias's hand. You trained him to protect space, not chase danger. Elias closed his fingers around the brass. I trained him to find the way home. Elias lowered himself onto a wooden bench beneath the barn awning while the rain settled into a steady curtain beyond the roof. Atlas stayed beside him, close enough that the old man's knee rested lightly against the dog's shoulder. Caleb stood a few feet away with the envelope still in his hand. Around them, the fair had softened. The music was quieter now. Families waited beneath striped tents. Water gathered in shallow silver pools along the service road, reflecting the colored bulbs above the empty midway. Tell me everything, Caleb said. Elias looked at the brass whistle in his palm. He came to us as 17 because numbers were easier for the program than names. He was young, smart enough to learn a room before anyone gave him an order. He noticed breathing, posture, where people looked when they were afraid. Most dogs waited for direction. He made decisions. Atlas lifted his head at the sound of Elias's voice, but did not move. The county partnered with a private training group, Elias continued. They wanted animals that could guide crowds, find safe exits, and respond before panic spread. It sounded honorable. At first, it was. Caleb heard the change in his tone. What happened? Elias watched the ring. They began caring more about results than judgment. Faster drills. Louder distractions. Less rest. I objected. They told me I was getting attached. His hands settled gently on Atlas's back, careful and almost uncertain. They were right about that. Caleb said nothing. The old man took a breath and continued. There was a training exercise in an old warehouse outside town. Smoke machines, alarms, blocked doors. Nothing was supposed to be dangerous. Then the power failed. A support beam shifted and part of the ceiling came down. No one was seriously hurt, but I was trapped behind debris. Atlas found a narrow opening and would not leave it. He kept returning to me until the others understood where I was. Elias opened his left hand. The curved scar crossed his palm like a pale crescent. I caught it on torn metal while crawling out. Atlas stayed under a fallen brace long enough to keep space open. That is why I named him Atlas. Not because he was strong, because he carried what no one asked him to carry. Caleb looked down at the German shepherd. Atlas's expression was calm, but one ear angled toward Elias as if listening to a story he already knew. After that, Elias said, the program called him unpredictable. They said he ignored commands. I said he understood the purpose better than we did. They scheduled him for removal. Caleb's face hardened. Removal from the program? Elias met his eyes. From every future assignment. The rain filled the silence. No graphic explanation was needed. Caleb understood what institutions sometimes did with animals they considered unusable. Elias looked away. I changed his file, listed him as lost during transfer. Then I moved him through a trusted handler until he reached a military placement office. I lost my job before the week ended. And you never looked for him? Caleb asked. Every year. Elias's voice nearly disappeared. From a distance. I followed reports, training notes, service records. Then I found yours. Caleb looked at the envelope again. Why me? Elias studied him carefully. Because your evaluation said you did not force silence to end. You waited inside it. Atlas needed someone who would understand that. Caleb felt something tighten in his chest. Not anger now, but the ache of being seen by a stranger years before he had known himself. Elias rested his hand on Atlas once more. I did not send him to serve you, he said. I sent him because I believed the two of you might keep each other from disappearing. Caleb sat across from Elias while the rain traced narrow paths from the edge of the awning. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Atlas remained between them, one shoulder touching Elias, one paw resting near Caleb's boot, as if he understood that both men were standing on opposite sides of the same wound. The envelope lay open in Caleb's hands. The paper had softened at the folds, but the dark blue circle around his name remained sharp. He read the handwritten line again. He understands silence. Send the dog to him. You made that decision from a file, Caleb said. Elias shook his head. Not only from a file. Caleb looked up. Elias reached into the canvas satchel and removed a second photograph, smaller and more worn than the one in the display. It showed Caleb years earlier, seated alone on the steps outside a military hospital. His hair was shorter then. His shoulders were rigid beneath a plain sweatshirt. Beside him sat an empty metal chair. Caleb recognized the day at once. It had been 3 weeks after he lost a fellow Marine named Daniel Price, the man who had shared every difficult mile of his final deployment and most of the quiet ones too. Where did you get this? Caleb asked. A rehabilitation coordinator sent it with your assessment, Elias said. She wrote that you refused every offer for group therapy, but you stayed outside each afternoon near the working dog yard. You never called the dogs over. You simply sat where they could see you. Caleb remembered. He had not known anyone noticed. Back then, words felt like doors he could not open. The dogs had asked nothing from him. They had only breathed, watched, and stayed. Elias turned the photograph over. Caleb's name was written there, along with a date and one short note. Does not demand trust. Atlas had stopped responding to most handlers, Elias said. He followed instructions, but he did not connect. He had learned that commands could change, records could disappear, and people could leave. When I read that note, I thought of him. Caleb looked at Atlas. The German shepherd's muzzle had grown lighter over the years, but his eyes were the same steady amber that had met Caleb on their first morning together. Atlas had been brought into the training yard without ceremony. He had walked past 2 other handlers, stopped in front of Caleb, and sat. Caleb had thought it was coincidence. He chose me, Caleb whispered. Yes, Elias said, but he was allowed to find you. The truth settled slowly. Caleb remembered the first nights when Atlas slept beside the apartment door, unwilling to rest completely. He remembered waking before sunrise and finding the dog already watching him. He remembered the day Atlas first placed his head beneath Caleb's hand, not because he had been called, but because Caleb had finally stopped pretending he was fine. You could have told me, Caleb said. Elias lowered his eyes. I was afraid the old program would reclaim him if anyone learned the transfer had been altered. Then the years passed, and fear became habit. Caleb studied the man before him. Elias did not look like someone asking to be forgiven. He looked like someone prepared to leave without it. Atlas rose, turned once, and lowered himself with his body stretched across both men's boots. The gesture was simple, final. Elias's hand hovered above the dog's back. He always did that when two handlers disagreed, he said softly. Made himself the line neither one would cross. Caleb felt the first hint of warmth return to his voice. Then maybe we should listen. The rain eased near sunset, leaving the fairgrounds washed clean beneath a pale band of gold. Water dripped from the barn roof in a slow rhythm. Far beyond the livestock stalls, the Ferris wheel began turning again, each colored light appearing one by one against the darkening sky. Caleb remained seated while Atlas rested across both men's boots, breathing deeply now, the tension gone from his shoulders. Elias looked toward the midway, where families were returning beneath umbrellas and fair workers were sweeping rainwater from the wooden platforms. I used to imagine this moment differently, he said. Caleb glanced at him. How? Elias gave a faint, tired smile. I thought he would run to me. I thought I would say his name, and every year between us would disappear. His fingers moved gently through the fur along Atlas's neck. But years do not disappear. They become part of what a soul carries. Caleb understood that better than he wanted to admit. He had spent a long time believing healing meant returning to the man he had been before grief changed the shape of his days. Atlas had taught him otherwise. The dog never asked him to go backward. He only stayed beside him while he learned how to move forward. He did remember you, Caleb said. That matters. Elias nodded, though his eyes remained on Atlas. He remembered the signal, the scar, the old way of asking permission. He remembered kindness, Caleb said. Elias looked at him then, surprised by the word. Caleb folded the photograph and the transfer papers carefully, then returned them to the envelope. You gave up your job to get him out. I corrected a mistake. You paid for it. Elias looked down at his worn boots. Some costs are easier to live with than regret. A gust moved through the open barn, carrying the smell of wet earth, coffee, and fresh kettle corn from the midway. Atlas lifted his head. Somewhere outside, a boy called for his father. A vendor laughed as a canvas awning released a pocket of rainwater onto the ground. Ordinary sounds. Safe sounds. Caleb realized that was what Elias had preserved all those years ago. Not a service record. Not a successful training program. A future full of ordinary sounds. Mornings on Caleb's porch. Long drives with the windows cracked. Quiet nights when Atlas slept within reach. The small life between missions that no official report ever measured. You saved him, Caleb said. Elias shook his head. I moved one piece of paper. Sometimes that is how saving starts. Elias's expression tightened, and he looked away before the emotion could settle fully on his face. Atlas rose, stretched, and turned toward Caleb. Then he crossed the narrow space and placed his head against Elias's knee. The old man stopped breathing for a second. His hand lowered slowly to the dog's cheek. Hello, Atlas, he whispered. This time, the name did not sound like a command or a memory. It sounded like gratitude. Caleb watched them and felt something inside him loosen. For years, he had thought Atlas belonged to the chapter of his life that came after loss. Now he understood the dog had carried another man's hope into that chapter long before Caleb knew he needed it. Elias had saved Atlas from being erased. Atlas had saved Caleb from disappearing into silence. Caleb had given Atlas a home. None of them had done it alone. The Ferris wheel lights reflected in the rainwater outside, trembling but unbroken. Atlas stepped back and sat between them, touching one boot with each side of his body. Caleb reached down and rested his hand on the dog's shoulder. Elias did the same. For a few quiet seconds, three lives met in one place, not as they had been, but as they had finally become. By the time the fair closed, the clouds had broken apart, and a clear moon had risen over the cottonwoods. The midway lights went dark one row at a time. Vendors folded tables, livestock handlers latched the final gates, and the last families crossed the gravel lot carrying sleepy children and damp stuffed animals. Caleb walked beside Elias toward the grandstand, while Atlas moved between them without needing a leash pulled tight. The ground still smelled of rain and trampled hay. Somewhere near the entrance, a broom scraped across wet pavement. Elias stopped at the first row of empty benches and looked out over the quiet arena. I should go, he said. Caleb studied him. Where? There is a small place about 20 miles north. I rent a room behind a repair shop. Elias gave a faint shrug. It is enough. Atlas looked up at him, ears forward. Caleb reached into his jacket pocket and removed the brass whistle Elias had set down earlier beside the envelope. He held it out. Elias stared at it, but did not take it. That belongs with him, he said. No, Caleb replied. It belongs with the man who taught him what it meant. Elias slowly accepted the whistle. The metal looked small in his weathered hand. He closed his fingers around it, then glanced toward the parking lot as though expecting Caleb to say goodbye. Instead, Caleb sat on the bench and placed a paper cup of coffee beside him. The fair opens again at 8 tomorrow, Caleb said. Atlas and I will be here at 7:30. Elias remained standing. You do not owe me that. I know. Caleb looked down at Atlas. Neither does he. The dog stepped closer to Elias and rested one paw on the toe of his worn boot. Elias lowered himself onto the bench. For several minutes, the three of them watched workers remove banners from the railings. No one tried to fill the silence. Caleb had spent years fearing silence because it gave memory too much room. Elias had hidden inside it because truth felt dangerous. Atlas seemed to understand both kinds. He lay down between them, his back against Caleb's boot and his head near Elias's knee, joining two separate histories with the simple warmth of his body. At last, Elias lifted the whistle but did not place it to his lips. He gave 3 soft notes with his breath. The sound drifted across the empty arena, quieter than the rustle of leaves. Atlas opened his eyes. In another life, those notes had meant watch the exits, find the safe path, bring someone home. This time, he did not rise. He did not scan the shadows or wait for an order. His tail touched the wooden floor once, then again. Elias smiled through eyes bright with tears. Caleb rested a hand on Atlas's shoulder. Beyond the grandstand, the Ferris wheel stood still beneath the moon, each empty car shining with rain. Some names are remembered because they are written into records. Others survive because someone speaks them gently when the world has gone quiet. Atlas had carried his name through distance, duty, and years of absence. Now, between the two men who had each saved him in a different way, he no longer had to carry it alone.